in a number of different places, on Twitter and on Reddit, I encountered criticisms about all sorts of things that people claim we don't talk about, and it's a critical failure of the book, like genetic drift, founder effects, genetic sweeps. And
as I pointed out, we also didn't include Punnett squares.
Right. But I would point out that this is an echo of a long-standing battle in evolutionary biology that you and I have been part of for decades. It's not like we're unaware of genetic drift, but the basic thing you need to understand to know what this is about is so evolution is defined as the change in gene frequency in a population over time. That's evolution. Almost always when people invoke evolution, they mean adaptation, which is something different. It's one of 4 mechanisms of evolution. Right. And so what they are effectively, and the thing that you need to understand is that almost all evolutionary change, Heather is closing the window because somebody is, I don't know, tearing up the street or something like that. Almost all evolutionary change is non-adaptive, right? It is mostly the result of drift and these other lesser mechanisms, migration and mutation. Now, all adaptation ultimately traces back to mutations that then got favored by selection. But the basic point is almost all evolution is not adaptive. Almost everything that matters is in that tiny subset that is adaptive.
Right.
And so this critique is like a lashing about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the same old, same old. Like I almost have less patience for this one because it's, the driftists, as some in evolutionary biology would call those who see drift as majorly explanatory, drift being the random element in evolution. That is, if you happened to be walking under the window when the piano fell out, then your death is due to drift, as opposed to you were helping, like you were somehow involved there as a feature of the piano being there, and you died, and then that would be selection. Randomness doesn't build complexity. Yeah. That's the argument at its base. That's all it takes, right? Drift is the random element in evolution. Mutation is the origin of all change. Gene flow is just the movement between populations, which is utterly important. But the 4 mechanisms of microevolution: mutation, origin of all variation; drift, the random element; flow, the movement between populations; and selection. Selection is that which builds complexity. And so is it more rare than drift? Sure. But it builds complexity and randomness can't.
Right. It can't do it. And, we could go on at length about this. But the reason that I'm focused on this is that at the point that multiple people are leveling this criticism, right, what it tells you is they don't have anything else, right? It's pretty empty. And I had one delightful experience I have to relate to you. So I saw one of these criticisms. Somebody on Reddit specifically took us to task in the book for not dealing with genetic sweep, founder effects, and drift. And I pointed out in a reply that, in fact, though these terms are not mentioned in there, I gave an example of each phenomenon. And I basically said, look, this is not important because it isn't relevant to the subject matter of the book. And the person responded by accusing me of not having read the book, which I thought
So were you not showing up as yourself somehow?
If you knew enough about us, you probably could have figured out it was me, but the basic nature of Reddit is that people's names aren't their names. And so anyway, yes, I thought that was lovely, and I should have screenshotted it, right?
Yes, you should have.
That one should have gone on my wall, but somebody then alerted him to who he was talking to, and he edited it. But anyway. Well,
that's funny. Yeah, that soon we'll start seeing that critique. You haven't even read your own. Wait, who wrote it then? Okay. So I guess I want to just sort of cap this off by saying that if you're scientifically uninterested, especially if you are also unshakable in what turns out to be a scientifically incoherent ideology, such as wokeness or trust the authorities, our book's going to be a threat to you. And it's not meant to be a threat to anyone. It's meant to be a way, to some degree, a guidebook, although it also does dive deep and introduces several new evolutionary concepts while also bringing people up to speed on several things that we know to be true in evolution that were, other people's contributions. it's meant to bring everyone in on the conversation about what it is to be human and how best to move forward. It's not a threat to actual scientists, nor is it a threat to those without scientific background who are eager to learn. So again, it's not that if you happen to be scientifically illiterate, you can't go here with us. Of course you can. So I'm reminded of an interaction we had with our wonderful editor shortly after we signed the book, and we really didn't know her at all. We signed the contract for the book a couple years ago, and she said, who is your intended audience? And I said, everyone. And I think she thought I was kidding. But I actually haven't asked Helen this, but I doubt she does now, because what I said to her was, look, certainly, us teaching at a not prestigious college still didn't get us access to all of what humanity has, although we've also traveled widely enough and interacted with so many types of people. But in our classrooms, we reached across differences that were far greater than you would expect to see in most college classrooms. And we found our common humanity there. And we found that people who came in, even people who came in as creationists, who came in specifically seeking to be armed against our kinds of ways of approaching the world, found things to embrace and to honor and to speak to in an evolutionary worldview. So, this is exactly what we found ourselves doing for 15 years in classrooms. And it's not, it's the evolutionary worldview and an understanding of humanity and other organisms that is what you and I are driven by much more deeply. But because we had this, what turns out to have been an interlude of 15 years, really learning how to educate and how to reach people who don't look or sound like us or believe the same things we do or have the same developmental histories, we feel like not only do all people deserve this kind of evolutionary toolkit, but they are capable of receiving it.
So I was thinking a little bit about the taxonomy of people who don't accept things like the Omega principle. And, and the point is it has to be proposed and you have to decide whether to accept it. But we get several different kinds of resistance, right? I see three kinds that we've encountered. One has to do with people who believe that you shouldn't analyze human behavior and culture with these tools. Not that it doesn't work, but that it's too dangerous, right? Yep. Now, I am stunned by this. Dawkins, when I met with him in October of 2018 in Chicago, I think it was 2018. In any case,
I can't remember now.
Whenever that may have been, espoused this perspective that he thought there was something dangerous about looking at human history through the lens of evolution, which shocked me, right? It seemed to me that he had switched positions from where he would have been in his previous incarnation. But nonetheless, there's an awful lot.
No, that's common among actually smart evolutionary biologists. I've heard it. I'm not going to name other names here, but I've heard it a lot.
Right. But it's also, it was the motivating force, it appears, behind Gould and Lewontin and all sorts of people who were on the other side of the question of adaptation, or as that is dismissed, adaptationism, right? So there was effectively a group of scientists who sought to, and were successful in many regards, in derailing the evolutionary analysis of people. So in the aftermath of sociobiology being coined as a term, there was this pushback, right? And it was disguised in many regards as this doesn't work, but really what it was is that's not a good idea.
Yep. There are some questions you should not ask.
Right.
Yep.
The second group, I would say, are a group of people who are confused about whether or not this is true.
Evolution
right?
stops at the neck, people.
Well, I don't want to dismiss them that way. I think you shouldn't accept Omega until you see why it has to be right, at which point, the burden of proof is on those of us who believe in something like Omega.
Yes.
Until you've met that burden, you shouldn't accept it. And then once you see it, hopefully the burden shifts. But anyway, I respect this group, and I see it as our obligation to convince them of why this is an important thing to understand and what it does to the understanding of people downstream of it. But the third group, the one that troubles me most, are people who are threatened in a career sense by the exploration of human beings as an evolutionary phenomenon. So, for example, people in the humanities, right?
More likely people in social sciences.
I would say actually we see it in both. But, if you look at, for example, just by...
But these modern bastardizations of fields that actually should have a tremendous amount to offer.
Well, I think they do potentially have a tremendous amount to offer. The problem is what the nominal field has to offer and the incentives of the individuals in it are quite different. And so if you look at something like the reaction that historians had to guns, germs, and steel, right? It was very, very negative. But when you look at the quality of the critique, it's not about the fact that it doesn't work. It's about its territoriality, right? And so the idea that, if you're going to do cultural anthropology, right, and you don't want to have to do an analysis that deals with adaptation as a phenomenon. You just simply want to, zoom in and look at cultures and compare them and imagine that you're not looking at a biological phenomenon, right? Then you need omega not to be right.
Right. It's stay in your laneism as a form of social territoriality.
It's in an environment in which the market causes this to emerge because people who are not going to be able to participate in that discussion nonetheless want to hold their position within the fields. And so these fields pretend that what they're doing is not impacted by evolutionary dynamics as a matter of,
Which means you have to build all sorts of epicycles. And, like the evolutionary view is clarifying. And once you know it, you can also figure out better. You have a better chance of figuring out how to avoid and evade the reprehensible parts of what our evolution has made us prone to. Right? Like that's the best way to make ourselves better, is to know what it is that we have inherited from the past.
Right. And, to the extent that you believe that something like cultural evolution or a study of cultures has a lot to offer, right? Mm-hmm. You want the most powerful tools with which to analyze it so you understand what it means rather than just being a purely descriptive phenomenon.
Yeah.
And so... we, the public, pay for fields to study things, right? We subsidize this work. And so the question is, are we getting what we have paid for? And we will get it much more successfully if we accept that there are simplifying rubrics that actually unite this into one story rather than making all of these things separate.
Okay. I guess I would finish by saying and recognize that we are almost supposedly done, and we have only gotten to a tiny bit of what we were hoping to get to today. I would say that our book is an invitation to think deeply about what we are and how to live better live better lives at both the individual and the societal level. Like, quite explicitly, that's what it is. So if you reject that goal out of hand, I wonder what your goal is. Like, what is it that you are serving, and what is it that you are trying to achieve? You may disagree with us, as the one review that we discuss does, and I think your taxonomy of the three types of ways that you come to disagreement with something like the Omega Principle is apt. I like that. So I wanted also to say here, before we move on to talking about this new research out of New Mexico, really, with regard to the peopling of the Americas, is that we most of this stuff isn't out yet, but we did some more interviews this week that were so varied in how they came across that it's just worth mentioning. So we were on Coast to Coast AM, which is apparently the longest running radio show out there, and it's very much not a science show. We got pushback on religion. We talked about the realignment. No, not we talked about. We were on the realignment. I was trying to understand. Are you sending me a message? We were on the realignment with host Sagar Enjeti and Marshall Kosloff. I hope I'm pronouncing Marshall's last name correctly, which was largely a political discussion, but we had in there a really nice dive actually into some of what many people who I think have been trained in social sciences and humanities, even just at the college level, imagine a Darwinian approach to human behavior would provide us. And so we're in that conversation, we talk about why it is that this is not an invitation to social Darwinism. This is not an invitation to go backwards, and it's not an invitation to pursue our worst angels at all. Quite the opposite. We talked with Brian Keating with Into the Impossible, which he describes as a podcast of stories, ideas, and speculations from the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. He's an astrophysicist and the distinguished professor of physics at UC San Diego. So that in that conversation, we got to finally talk a little bit about aliens too, which I thought was fun. And then Sounds of Film with Tom Needham, different feel entirely. He's this show has been on the air for 30 years, and you've been on it before, but we were able to talk in just such a very different way. So I'm just thrilled to be able to be having the diversity of conversations we're having. It's not just with scientists, and it's not just not with scientists, and it's not just with people who come from a religious perspective or not. It's across the board. And so in service of that, before we talk about the evidence of humans in North America during the last glacial maximum, did you want to say a few things about the anomalies that we've been seeing with regard to the availability of the book before we sort of move on beyond talking about this?
Yeah,
this book. Here's our one copy. Here's the copy we've got. Still.
I just want to. We don't know what to make of the weird. There is obviously a supply chain issue, but we also know that tens of thousands of books have been printed and presumably delivered to retailers, and we see Amazon oscillating, for example, between
temporarily out of stock, and briefly it said in stock soon with a delivery date in November, and now it's back to temporarily out of stock.
Right. So we don't know what to make of it, but we would ask people to just, if you are looking for it, either order it and it will come hopefully sooner than those projections, or it's available on Barnes and Noble still. Lots of other places are out. It sure is.
And we forgot to say at the very start, like we made the New York Times bestseller list.
This is true.
Yeah, and it just feels amazing. And we're the second highest selling book in nonfiction on Amazon last week. That's sure not to be the case this week, because they literally haven't had any copies to sell.
Right.
The entire week. They haven't had any copies since the third day after publication, which is, it feels good, but it also feels frustrating. And so if you want the book and you don't have it, Barnes and Noble does still have it.